The blood trail was getting worse, which meant whatever Ethan was tracking was either dying or getting desperate. Neither option made his job easier. He pushed through dense undergrowth in Halcyon VII's northern preserve, following signs that told a story he'd seen too many times. Illegal hunters, advanced weapons, something fleeing for its life. Ethan Cross had been a wildlife rehabilitation specialist for 3 years, which was a fancy title for someone who spent most of his time covered in mud and alien biochemistry, while trying to convince both human colonists and Kyveran natives that conservation mattered more than profit margins. It was unglamorous work that paid poorly and earned him exactly zero respect from either government, but someone had to do it. The preserve was supposed to be protected territory, a rare example of human-Kyveran cooperation, where both species agreed to maintain the ecosystem. In practice, it was where poachers operated with impunity because neither government wanted to patrol aggressively enough to risk offending the other. He found the snare in a clearing where the canopy opened to Halcyon's twin suns. High-tech trap, military grade, definitely not legal for civilian use. And caught in its crushing grip was what looked like a chiral, a predatory species native to Kyveran worlds, about the size of a wolf but with crystalline fur that shifted colors based on emotion or camouflage needs. This one's fur was cycling through distress patterns, rapid shifts between deep blue and pale white. It was badly injured, the trap crushing its rear leg, and blood matted the crystalline coat. When it saw Ethan, it tried to snarl, but the sound came out more like a whimper. The logical response would be to call Kyveran Wildlife Services. Chirals were technically their responsibility, and approaching an injured predator was a great way to lose important body parts. But Ethan could see fresh boot prints nearby. The hunters were still in the area, probably waiting to return and collect their prize, and the chiral was dying. He'd never been good at watching things suffer when he could help. "Easy," he said quietly, using the calm tone he'd perfected over years of working with frightened creatures. "I know this hurts. I know I'm terrifying. But those hunters are coming back, and you're not surviving this trap without help." The chiral watched him with eyes that seemed far too intelligent for an animal. They were a deep amber color, tracking his movements with what looked like assessment rather than simple fear. Ethan had always suspected chirals were more cognitively complex than xenobiologists admitted, but proving it required research funding nobody wanted to provide. He approached slowly, hands visible, speaking in that same steady tone. The chiral tensed but didn't attack, either too weak or deciding Ethan wasn't the immediate threat. He examined the trap carefully. Military design, pressure-sensitive, meant to immobilize without killing immediately. Whoever set this wanted their target alive and suffering. "This is going to hurt," Ethan warned, though he knew the creature couldn't understand standard. "But it's going to hurt less than staying here." He triggered the trap's emergency release, a safety feature the manufacturers included for when humans inevitably caught themselves. The mechanism opened with a hiss. The chiral yelped and tried to bolt, but its injured leg couldn't support weight. It collapsed, panting, fur cycling through pain white. Ethan moved quickly, wrapping the creature in emergency medical fabric from his field kit. Chirals were dangerous when cornered, but this one was too injured to fight effectively. It made sounds that almost seemed like language, complex vocalizations that his communicator tried and failed to translate, but Ethan attributed that to stress responses. "You're heavier than you look," he muttered, lifting the wrapped chiral carefully. It was true, chirals were dense, their crystalline structure making them weigh more than their size suggested. The creature kept making those almost language sounds, and its eyes never left his face. The trek back to his rehabilitation facility took an hour of careful navigation through terrain that tried very hard to kill him. The chiral was quiet except for occasional whimpers, and twice Ethan had to stop and adjust his grip when the creature shuddered with pain. His facility was modest, a converted research station with medical equipment, holding pens for different species, and living quarters that smelled perpetually of disinfectant and whatever he'd last treated. He carried the chiral to his main examination table, carefully unwrapping the medical fabric. "Okay," he said, scanning the injuries with diagnostic equipment. "Broken leg, definitely. Some kind of toxin in your system, which is weird because chirals shouldn't be vulnerable to most standard poisons. You're lucky. If those hunters had come back, you wouldn't have lasted another hour." The chiral watched him work with those two intelligent eyes. Ethan set the broken leg with practiced efficiency, administered broad-spectrum painkillers that should work on Kyveran biochemistry, and hooked up an IV drip to counter dehydration. The creature relaxed as the painkillers took effect, those complex vocalizations tapering off into something almost like purring. "You're going to be fine," Ethan assured it. "Couple of weeks recovery, then we'll figure out how to release you back to your territory. Though if those hunters are still operating, you might want to consider relocating." He was updating his treatment log when the chiral's fur began to shimmer. Not the normal color shift, something else entirely. The crystalline structure rippled like water, and the creature's form began to change. Ethan watched in frozen shock as the chiral dissolved and reformed. Limbs lengthening, body reshaping, crystalline fur retracting into skin that shifted through similar color patterns before settling on a pale blue-gray. In 10 seconds, he went from treating an injured predator to staring at an unconscious Kyveran woman on his medical table. She was wearing the tattered remains of expensive clothing beneath the transformation. Her features were elegant even in unconsciousness, with the distinctive bone structure of Kyveran nobility. The crystalline patterns remained in her hair, which was longer than most Kyverans wore and still shifting through distress colors. Every alarm in Ethan's facility started screaming. Biological anomaly sensors, security alerts, emergency medical systems detecting sapient life in the predator treatment area. His communicator was flooding with automated warnings about unauthorized presence. "Okay," Ethan said to nobody in particular, because his only witness was unconscious. "That's new. That's definitely new." His hands were shaking as he ran biometric scans. The facility's medical database took 30 seconds to process, then displayed results that made him question his sanity. Identity confirmed. Princess Sareth Kyvir. Royal House. Kyvir Dynasty. Succession rank 4th. Status, traveling abroad official records. Security clearance, sovereign level. Below that, the medical analysis showed evidence of poisoning. A sophisticated toxin designed to interfere with Kyveran's shape-shifting abilities. It was wearing off now, but it had been strong enough to trap her in primal form and make her vulnerable. Ethan stared at the woman who, 10 minutes ago, he'd been treating as an injured predator. The hunters weren't poaching animals. They were assassinating royalty. Before he could process this revelation, his facility's external sensors detected incoming aircraft. Multiple signatures. Coming fast. He ran to the window and saw Kyveran security vessels landing in his clearing with the kind of aggressive precision that suggested they weren't here to negotiate. Then he saw human colonial security approaching from the opposite direction, probably responding to his facility's emergency alerts. Everyone had weapons. Nobody looked particularly calm. Ethan looked at the unconscious princess on his medical table, then at the two approaching forces who definitely wanted to secure her, and realized his quiet life, as a wildlife rehabilitation specialist, had just become exponentially more complicated. His door burst open. A Kyveran commander in full combat armor swept in with a security team, weapons raised, scanning for threats. They found Ethan standing between them and the princess, with his hands raised in the universal gesture of, "Please don't shoot the civilian." "Step away from Princess Sareth," the commander ordered. His armor markings identified him as Varix, likely high-ranking based on the decorations. "She's injured," Ethan said, trying for calm despite adrenaline making his voice shake. "I was treating what I thought was a chiral when she..." You will surrender custody of the princess immediately, Varix interrupted. Nobody's surrendering anything until you explain your armed presence in protected territory, Captain Morrison's voice cut in. She appeared in the doorway with her own security team, creating a tense standoff in Ethan's medical bay. This is shared jurisdiction. You don't conduct military operations here without notification. We are securing a member of the royal family, Varix said. That supersedes your colonial protocols. Not when it involves human citizens on protected land. They were still arguing when Princess Sareth stirred. Her eyes opened, that same amber color from the chiral form, and focused on Ethan with recognition that suggested she'd been conscious during at least part of her rescue. She tried to sit up, winced, and Ethan moved instinctively to support her before either security force could intervene. She placed her hand over his heart. The gesture was formal, deliberate, carrying weight that Ethan didn't understand, but everyone else in the room apparently did because they went very still. She spoke in Kyveran, complex melodic phrases that held the rhythm of ritual. Ethan's communicator translated half a second later, right of protection, invoked and witnessed. By my blood and his courage, the bond is sealed. I name you guardian, and by our oldest laws, this bond cannot be broken except by death or mutual release. Varix looked like he just swallowed poison. Morrison's expression cycled through confusion, realization, and something that might have been sympathy. What did she just say? Ethan asked, though his communicator had translated clearly. He needed someone to explain it in words that made sense to a wildlife specialist who just had a very weird day. Morrison pulled him aside while Varix argued with the princess in rapid Kyveran. The right of protection is an ancient tradition. When someone saves royal life, they become sworn guardian. It grants legal authority, protection under Kyveran law, and this is the complicated part, provisional consort status. Ethan processed that. So I'm engaged to an alien princess because I thought I was rescuing a space wolf. Essentially, yes. And this is going to create massive political complications for everyone involved. Princess Sareth was arguing with Varix, her voice weak but firm. Ethan caught fragments through his communicator. My right to invoke, saved my life, will not revoke. Varix clearly disagreed. So did most of the security forces present. But Sareth had invoked something that carried legal weight, and nobody could simply dismiss it. Captain Morrison sighed. Mr. Cross, you're now entangled in Kyveran royal law. This will require diplomatic intervention, legal review, and probably several months of bureaucratic nightmares. In the meantime, you're coming with us to secured facilities until we sort this out. Can I at least finish updating my medical logs? Ethan asked. I was halfway through documenting a broken leg treatment when everything got weird. Nobody laughed. Apparently saving alien royalty removed people's sense of humor. They transported him to Colonial Administration's secured wing, comfortable quarters that were definitely house arrest regardless of what Morrison called them. Princess Sareth went to the Kyveran embassy, separated from him despite her protests about the right requiring proximity. Ethan sat in his cell/guest quarters and stared at his medical logs, where he'd been documenting chiral rehabilitation before discovering his patient was actually fourth in line to an alien throne. His communicator chimed. Priority message from Colonial Administration. You are to cooperate fully with diplomatic officials regarding dissolution of the unauthorized bond. The right of protection, while recognized under Kyveran law, is not binding on human citizens. You will formally refuse the designation and return to normal duties. Another message arrived seconds later, this one from Kyveran diplomatic channels. Princess Sareth will be questioned regarding her invocation of ancient rites in politically sensitive circumstances. The bond may be subject to review and possible revocation, pending royal court approval. Both governments had decided the right was inconvenient. Both were going to pressure them to dissolve it. Ethan thought about the moment he'd approached the trap, seeing a creature suffering and deciding to help despite the risks. He'd made that choice without knowing the chiral was royalty, without expecting reward or recognition. He'd done it because leaving something to die when he could help felt wrong. And now he was learning that simple acts of compassion had complicated consequences when alien royalty was involved. His door chimed. Authorization for a visitor, Princess Sareth herself, accompanied by enough guards to invade a small moon. She entered with the kind of dignity that made his government tissue furniture look embarrassed. She was wearing proper clothing now, though her hair still held those crystalline patterns that shifted colors. She looked exhausted but determined. "They're going to try to force us to dissolve the bond," she said without preamble. "Both our governments. They'll claim political necessity and legal technicalities. They'll pressure and threaten and make our lives difficult until we comply." "Yeah," Ethan agreed. "I got the memos, very official, very urgent. Several paragraphs about how I should formally refuse being your guardian." "Will you?" She asked it directly, watching his face. Ethan thought about it, about his quiet life treating injured animals, about the political complications and bureaucratic nightmares ahead, about how much simpler everything would be if he just said no. "Tell me something first," he said. "Why were you in the preserve disguised as a chiral? And why did someone try to kill you?" Sareth sat carefully, favoring her injured leg. "Because I discovered something my government doesn't want anyone to know, and neither does yours." She told him about the conspiracy, officials from both species coordinating to maintain profitable conflict, about her investigation and the assassination attempt that followed, about the poison designed to trap her in primal form so her death would look like an unfortunate accident. "You saved my life," she said quietly, "without knowing who I was, without expecting anything in return. That's why I invoked the right, not to trap you, but because that kind of courage deserves recognition. My people's oldest laws exist to honor those who protect without self-interest." "But honoring me creates political problems," Ethan said. "Yes, but dissolving the right without investigating why I needed protection creates bigger ones. Someone tried to assassinate me because I got too close to the truth. If we surrender now, they win." Ethan looked at her, exhausted alien princess who'd survived an assassination attempt and was now facing pressure from her own government to abandon the person who saved her. "Okay," he said. "I won't refuse the right. But I'm going to need you to explain what a guardian actually does, because my job experience is mostly apply bandages to creatures trying to bite me, and I'm not sure how that translates to royal protection." Sareth smiled for the first time since the transformation. "We'll figure it out together." The guards looked uncomfortable. The governments would be furious. But they'd made a choice, to stand together and investigate the conspiracy rather than surrender to political pressure. It was possibly the worst decision Ethan had ever made. It was also the only one that felt right. The supervised meetings to discuss dissolution terms became cover for something more productive, actually investigating the conspiracy that had tried to kill a princess. Ethan and Sareth met daily in a secured conference room under observation by both governments, theoretically negotiating how to dissolve the right while actually piecing together evidence of high-level corruption. Sareth had intelligence she'd gathered before the assassination attempt, financial records suggesting illegal coordination between human and Kyvran officials, communications logs that didn't quite add up, testimony from sources who'd witnessed suspicious activity. Ethan contributed local knowledge. He'd worked in the preserve for 3 years and knew the patterns, knew which officials consistently approved permits for questionable activities, knew the logistics networks that could support assassins operating in protected territory. "This official," Ethan said, highlighting a name in the Human Colonial Administration. "Administrator Chen. He's approved 17 special permits for resource extraction in the preserve over the last year. Every one of them, involved areas that mysteriously suffered ecological damage within months. And this minister, Sareth added, pulling up Kyveran records, Minister Telvos, he controls weapons procurement for our military. His family fortune has tripled since the border disputes began. They were building a pattern, human and Kyveran officials who profited from tension between their species. Arms sales, resource extraction rights, security contracts. Peace would cost them billions, so they ensured peace never quite arrived. Commander Varix interrupted one of their sessions, his expression suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. Princess, the royal court demands your return. They question your judgment in invoking the right and wish to discuss your unconventional investigation methods. Tell the court I'm exercising my authority as fourth heir to investigate threats to royal security, Sareth replied. The assassination attempt was real. The conspiracy is real. I won't return until I have evidence comprehensive enough that even my cousin can't dismiss it. Her cousin, it turned out, was third in line to the throne and deeply invested in maintaining the current profitable status quo. He'd been undermining her investigation from the start. Captain Morrison delivered similar pressure on Ethan. The colonial governor wants this resolved. You're to formally refuse the right, submit to debriefing, and return to your facility. This entanglement is creating diplomatic complications we can't afford. With respect, Captain, someone tried to kill a princess to prevent her from exposing corruption. That seems like the kind of diplomatic complication we should be addressing rather than ignoring. Morrison's expression suggested she agreed but couldn't say so officially. Just be careful. You're making powerful people nervous, and nervous powerful people tend to do stupid things. She was right. 3 days later, someone tried to kill Ethan. It was subtle, a food delivery contaminated with a toxin designed to mimic natural illness. He caught it only because years of working with alien biochemistry had taught him to scan everything before consumption. The toxin would have caused organ failure that looked like unfortunate natural causes, eliminating the inconvenient human guardian before the right could be ratified. Sareth's reaction was immediate and furious. She demanded full investigation, invoked royal authority, and made it clear that further attempts on either of their lives would be treated as acts of war against the Kyveran crown. It was the first time Ethan saw her exercise the full weight of her position, and it was impressive enough that even the conspirators backed off temporarily. But temporary wasn't permanent. They had maybe 72 hours before the pressure became insurmountable. They spent those hours compiling everything: financial records, communication logs, testimony from Sareth's sources, and Ethan's contacts in the preserve. They identified the conspiracy's architects: Minister Telvos on the Kyveran side, Administrator Chen on the human side, both coordinating through intermediaries to maintain deniable separation. The evidence showed years of coordinated effort to prevent peace. Attacks staged to look like the other species' aggression. Moderate officials assassinated by extremists who were never caught. Resources funneled to keep both militaries dependent on the very people profiting from conflict. We have enough, Sareth said on the final day, reviewing their compiled evidence. We can prove conspiracy. We can show coordination. We can demonstrate that officials from both our governments have been actively sabotaging peace efforts. And then what? Ethan asked. We present this to people who probably don't want to know, who benefit from the status quo. Then we make it impossible for them to ignore. We invoke every legal authority we have, my royal position, your rights as guardian, and we force both governments to acknowledge the truth. It was a terrible plan that would probably get them both in serious trouble. It was also the only option they had. The joint session was called for the ultimatum deadline. Both governments assembled to formally dissolve the right and separate the problematic princess from her inconvenient human guardian. Ethan and Sareth entered together, and instead of compliance, they presented evidence. Sareth exercised her authority as princess to demand formal inquiry. Ethan, protected by the right of protection, claimed his right to present testimony before the Kyvran court, something no human had ever done. The rules were ancient and binding enough that even officials who wanted them silenced had to allow it. They walked both assemblies through the conspiracy, financial records proving coordination, communication logs showing attacks were staged, testimony demonstrating that peace negotiations had been deliberately sabotaged by officials who profited from continued tension. Administrator Chen tried to shut them down. Minister Telvos invoked procedural objections. But Sareth was royalty exercising legitimate authority, and Ethan was a recognized guardian with legal standing. They couldn't be simply dismissed. The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable. Some officials were arrested immediately. Others attempted to flee and were detained. The conspiracy unraveled because exposure was the one thing it couldn't survive. Once both governments acknowledged the truth, maintaining the lie became impossible. In the aftermath, Ethan and Sareth faced an absurd reality. They were bound by the right of protection, which made him guardian consort to an alien princess. It came with authority neither had wanted and responsibilities both were completely unprepared for. "You can be released from the right," Sareth offered. They were in a private room after the chaos of arrests and emergency sessions, both exhausted. "We've fulfilled its purpose. I'm safe. The conspiracy is exposed. You can return to your wildlife rehabilitation and pretend this never happened." Ethan thought about his quiet life in the preserve, about treating injured creatures and avoiding political complications, about how much simpler everything would be if he just accepted release. "What happens if I stay?" he asked. "Then you're officially my guardian consort, which means you have standing in both our governments. You can bridge our species, help implement the peace frameworks that should have existed years ago. It won't be easy. Both our peoples will question the arrangement, and there will be constant political pressure." She paused. "But I think we work well together, and the galaxy needs people willing to stand in uncomfortable positions." Ethan smiled. "You know what convinced me to help you in the first place, when I thought you were a chiral suffering in that trap. I helped because leaving something to die when I could do something felt wrong. That hasn't changed just because you turned out to be royalty. So you'll stay?" "I'll stay, but I'm keeping my job in the preserve. Someone has to make sure the actual animals get treated too." Sareth laughed, a sound of genuine relief and unexpected affection. "Agreed. The galaxy's most unusual guardian consort will split his time between diplomatic functions and bandaging creatures that try to bite him." "That's basically my skill set, yes." The year that followed was complicated. Both governments had to adjust to a human serving in Kyvran royal capacity. Peace frameworks that should have been implemented years ago finally took hold now that the profiteers were removed. The disputed territories began genuine cooperation. Ethan split his time between the preserve and diplomatic functions, bridging two species through the simple act of caring about both. He still treated injured creatures, still got covered in mud and alien biochemistry, still filed reports nobody read. But he also helped implement conservation protocols that both governments actually honored, helped negotiate resource sharing that benefited everyone rather than exploiting tensions. Sareth ruled with renewed authority, her investigation having exposed corruption at the highest levels. The assassination attempt became proof that she'd been threatening the right people, and her survival, thanks to a human wildlife specialist, became a story both species told about unexpected cooperation. Sometimes reporters asked Ethan about the day he rescued an alien princess disguised as a predator. His answer never changed. "I didn't rescue a princess. I helped a creature that was suffering." That it turned out to be royalty was surprising, but it doesn't change the fundamental decision. You help when you can, regardless of who or what needs helping. That's not heroism, it's just basic decency. And Princess Sareth, whose life was saved by someone expecting nothing in return, proved that sometimes the best guardians are chosen by accident, recognized through simple acts of compassion that change everything. The fragile peace held, not because it was easy, but because enough people finally decided it was worth the difficult work of maintaining. And it started with one man pulling a wounded creature from a trap, not knowing he was rescuing royalty, just knowing he couldn't walk away. The memorial they eventually built in the northern preserve marked the spot where the trap had been set. Not a grand monument, just a simple marker with two inscriptions, one in Standard, one in Kyveran, that read, "Here compassion transcended species. Here courage required no recognition. Here peace began." Visitors came from both species, standing on ground where an assassination attempt had failed, because one person chose to help rather than walk away. It became a pilgrimage site for those who believed cooperation was possible. Proof that sometimes the most significant moments in history begin with the smallest acts of kindness. Ethan visited on the anniversary as he always did, bringing Sareth with him. They stood together at the marker, remembering the day everything changed. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. It was a ritual between them now, this question she asked every year. "I trapped you in a life you never wanted. Political complications, diplomatic functions, responsibilities that have nothing to do with wildlife rehabilitation." "You didn't trap me," Ethan said, as he always did. "I chose, and I keep choosing. Every day I decide whether this matters enough to stay, and every day the answer is yes. Even when my cousin complains that a human guardian is undermining traditional values. Especially then. Your cousin needs regular reminding that traditions that exclude cooperation aren't worth preserving." She smiled, the expression she wore when political formality could be set aside. "The council wants us to formalize the bond, make it permanent rather than provisional. They say a guardian consort in temporary status creates legal ambiguity." "And what do you want?" Ethan asked. Sareth was quiet for a moment, watching birds, actual birds, not disguised princesses, circle overhead. "I want what we have. Partnership built on mutual respect rather than political necessity. Someone who sees me as Sareth rather than princess or sovereign or whatever title needs managing. You're the only person in my life who met me at my most vulnerable and chose to help without calculating advantage." "That's not entirely true," Ethan pointed out. "I calculated that leaving you in that trap was morally indefensible and that the hunters might return. I made a tactical decision about acceptable risks. You risked yourself for what you believed was an animal. That's the point. No political calculation, no expectation of reward, just compassion towards something that was suffering." A group of Kyveran students approached, recognizing the princess. They were young enough that the conspiracy was history rather than living memory, which meant they could ask questions with the directness of those who hadn't lived through the trauma. "Is it true you were disguised as a chiral when he found you?" one asked, gesturing at Ethan. "Yes," Sareth confirmed. "The poison forced me into primal form. I was trapped and dying when he arrived." "And you really didn't know she was a princess?" another student asked Ethan. "I thought I was rescuing an endangered predator," Ethan said. "The princess part was a surprise I discovered after administering painkillers and setting a broken leg. Not the typical way to meet royalty." "But you invoked the right anyway," a third student said to Sareth. "Even though he didn't know, even though it would be complicated." "Especially because he didn't know," Sareth replied. "The right of protection exists to honor those who act from compassion rather than calculation. He embodied that perfectly, helped without knowing who I was, without expecting recognition. That's the kind of courage our oldest laws were designed to recognize." The students left with more questions than answers, which both Ethan and Sareth agreed was appropriate for young people learning that real life was messier than textbooks admitted. Later, in the rehabilitation facility where this had all started, Ethan treated an actual chiral. This one genuinely an animal, injured in a territorial dispute. He worked with practiced efficiency, setting broken bones and administering treatment while the creature made complex vocalizations that his equipment couldn't quite translate. You ever wonder if other chirals are also disguised royalty? Sareth asked, watching from a safe distance. She'd learned to stay back during treatments after one memorable incident involving a startled creature and very expensive diplomatic robes. Every single time, Ethan admitted. I've developed a slight paranoia about it. I scan everything now just to make sure I'm not accidentally treating the Emperor. My father finds that hilarious, by the way. He asks about your royal creature screening protocols every time we speak. Your father has a concerning sense of humor for someone who rules 14 systems. The chiral recovered under Ethan's care and was released back to the preserve 3 weeks later. It was one of dozens he treated that year, ordinary animals living ordinary lives, none of them disguised royalty. But he treated each one with the same care he'd shown that day in the clearing because the lesson hadn't changed. You help when you can, regardless of who or what needs helping. The diplomatic work continued. Ethan attended functions where he was spectacularly out of place, a wildlife specialist among politicians and nobles, someone whose formal education was in animal behavior rather than interstellar relations. But that outsider perspective proved valuable. He asked questions others assumed had answers. He identified patterns from his work in the preserve that translated to larger systems. He bridged species through the simple fact of caring about both. Sareth's investigation had exposed the conspiracy, but the work of actually dismantling profitable warfare took years. Trade agreements to replace weapons sales, cooperative ventures that benefited both species, educational exchanges that taught young people from both sides that the other species was people rather than propaganda. It was unglamorous work that involved endless meetings and bureaucratic negotiations. But Ethan had learned through wildlife rehabilitation that the most important work was often the least celebrated. The patient, persistent effort of maintaining systems that kept everyone alive and healthy. 3 years after the rescue, the Kyveran Royal Court formally recognized the right of protection as permanent. Ethan became the first human guardian consort in recorded history, which came with a title he never used and responsibilities he mostly delegated to people who actually understood court protocol. The ceremony was elaborate, full royal regalia, ancient traditions, speeches in multiple languages. Ethan wore formal clothing that made him feel like he was playing dress-up, standing beside Sareth while officials from both species witnessed the bond's formalization. "You're sure about this?" Sareth whispered during a particularly long ceremonial blessing. "Last chance to escape to a quiet life treating injured creatures." "I'm treating injured systems instead," Ethan whispered back. "Same principle, larger scale. Also the pay is slightly better. You're terrible at accepting ceremonial honors with appropriate dignity." "It's one of my most endearing qualities. You knew what you were getting when you invoked the right." She laughed quietly, which scandalized several traditional ministers who believed royal ceremonies should maintain absolute solemnity. Ethan considered that a victory. The work continued. Not because it was easy, cooperation between species never was, but because enough people had decided it mattered. The conspiracy's exposure had revealed how close both civilizations had come to permanent warfare maintained by those who profited from suffering. Nobody wanted to return to that, which meant they had to do the difficult work of building something better. Ethan split his time between the preserve and diplomatic functions, between treating injured animals and negotiating between governments. It was an absurd combination that shouldn't have worked but somehow did, because at its core, both jobs required the same fundamental skill, recognizing when something was broken and having the patience to help it heal. 5 years after the rescue, Halcyon VII hosted its first joint scientific conference. human and Kyveran researchers working together on ecosystem preservation. The preserve that had been a battlefield for poachers became a model for cooperation, proving that shared resources could be protected rather than exploited. Ethan gave the opening address, standing before scientists from both species, speaking about the importance of conservation and cross-species cooperation. He told them about the day he'd found a wounded creature in a trap, not knowing it was royalty, just knowing it needed help. "That's what we're here to do," he said. "Not rescue princesses, though that worked out, but recognize when something needs protecting and have the courage to act. Every creature in this preserve, every ecosystem we study, every cooperative venture we attempt, they all require the same fundamental choice. Help when you can, regardless of how complicated it makes your life." The scientists applauded. Sareth, sitting in the front row in full royal regalia because some occasions demanded it, smiled with the kind of pride that transcended political calculation. After the conference, they walked through the preserve together, following the trail to where the trap had been. The area had healed, new growth covering the scars, the ecosystem recovering from years of exploitation. It was still protected territory, but now both governments actually enforced that protection rather than using it as a convenient fiction. "Sometimes I think about that day," Sareth said, "about how close I came to dying in that trap, about how everything would be different if you'd followed procedure and called Kyveran Wildlife Services instead of helping directly." "I think about it too," Ethan admitted, "about how one decision changed everything, but I can't regret it. Even with all the complications that followed, we've built something worth building. A piece that actually holds. More than that, a framework that proves cooperation is possible, that different species can work together when they stop being controlled by those who profit from division." He paused. "Also, I got to meet an alien princess, which is significantly more interesting than my previous career trajectory suggested. And I got a guardian who treats me like a person rather than a political asset," Sareth said. "Someone who saw me at my most vulnerable and chose compassion over convenience. That's rarer than you think, especially in royal circles." They stood together at the memorial marker, watching Halcyon's twin sons set over territory that had been contested but was slowly becoming shared. Behind them, the rehabilitation facility hummed with activity, injured creatures being treated by staff from both species, working together because the work mattered more than old divisions. "You know what I've learned," Ethan said. "The biggest problems, war, environmental destruction, systemic injustice, they all seem impossibly large, but they're made of individual decisions. Someone choosing to help rather than walk away. Someone refusing to accept profitable cruelty as inevitable. Someone standing in uncomfortable positions because the alternative is surrendering to systems that don't serve anyone except those at the top." That's a very philosophical perspective for someone who primarily works with injured animals. Animals are excellent teachers. They don't lie about their needs or pretend suffering is acceptable for political convenience. They just exist, and you either help or you don't. Everything else is complicated, but that choice is simple. Sareth took his hand, a gesture that would have been politically significant if anyone had been watching, but they were alone in the preserve where privacy was possible. "Thank you for choosing to help, for staying when you could have walked away, for building this with me. Thank you for not eating me when you were still in chiral form," Ethan replied. "I appreciate the restraint. Always with the jokes. It's how I cope with being accidentally engaged to an alien princess. Humor or existential crisis, and humor seemed more productive." They walked back together as darkness fell, following familiar trails through terrain they'd both learned to protect. The preserve was healing. The peace was holding. Both species were learning cooperation. And it all started because one man found a creature suffering in a trap and made the simple choice to help, not knowing he was rescuing royalty, just knowing that leaving something to die when he could act felt wrong. That choice had consequences neither of them could have predicted. It created complications both would spend years navigating, but it also created something worth creating. Proof that compassion transcended species, that courage didn't require recognition, and that peace was possible when enough people decided it mattered more than profit. The memorial marker stood in the preserve, noting the spot where everything changed, where a guardian met a princess, where one species learned to help another, where the simplest act of compassion rewrote history. And in the rehabilitation facility, Ethan Cross, wildlife specialist, guardian consort, bridge between species, continued the unglamorous work of helping creatures heal, because someone had to, and he'd never learned how to walk away when walking away meant leaving something to suffer. The galaxy was better for it.